Somewhere past the west coast of Ireland, your aircraft settles onto a speed and holds it. Not for a few minutes, for the next 5 or 6 hours, all the way across the Atlantic. It isn't the fastest speed the aircraft can fly. It isn't the cheapest either. And here's the part that should bother you. The computer on the flight deck has already worked out a better number. It updates that number continuously against the wind outside and the fuel left in the tanks. The crew can see it. They are not allowed to fly it. Every day, hundreds of aircraft cross that ocean, burning more fuel than they strictly need to, deliberately. And nobody involved treats it as a problem. The airline knows. The regulator knows. The crew knows. Nobody files anything because nothing has gone wrong. The North Atlantic is the busiest oceanic airspace on the planet. Well over 400,000 flights a year cross it, and all of them are doing this. To understand why, you have to start with something that sounds like it can't be true in 2026. For most of that crossing, nobody can see your airplane. Not the controller, not the airline, nobody. Let's start there because the first piece of the answer is the simplest one. Radar has a horizon, its line of sight, so the curvature of the Earth eventually gets in the way, and beyond a certain distance, the returns stop. Off a coastline, en route radar coverage typically reaches somewhere around 250 miles, about 400 kilometers, before it runs out. Now look at what that means over the North Atlantic. It's roughly 3,000 miles wide. 250 miles of coverage on each side leaves an enormous middle where no radar reaches anything. So for the bulk of a transatlantic crossing, the controller isn't watching a target on a screen. Historically, position updates came in roughly every 14 minutes, and between them, the aircraft existed as a calculation. Sit with that. Controllers were separating traffic they could not observe, using estimates of where each aircraft ought to be. And for most of this system's history, they couldn't easily talk to it either. Out of radar range, you're also out of range of normal radio, so crossings ran on high-frequency radio, which bounces signals off the upper atmosphere and is notoriously difficult to listen to. Crews passed a position report to a radio operator who relayed it to the controller. Data link only overtook high frequency as the primary means of communication in 2006, which is far more recent than most people assume. So picture the real situation. An aircraft reports crossing a waypoint. The next report is due around an hour later. In between, the controller has a track, a time, and a speed, and builds everything else out of those three numbers. Which brings the obvious question. If you can't see them, how do you keep them apart? You do the only thing left. You predict them. And a prediction is only as good as its inputs. Think about what you'd need. You know where an aircraft entered, you know its route. If you also know exactly how fast it's going, you can calculate where it will be in an hour, in 3 hours, in 5. Do that for every aircraft in the system, and you can guarantee they never occupy the same piece of sky without ever seeing a single one. But that entire structure rests on one fragile assumption. Everybody's speed has to be a known quantity, which is where the rule comes in, and it has a name, the Mach number technique. Here's how it works in practice. Before an aircraft reaches the ocean, air traffic control issues an oceanic clearance, and that clearance contains an assigned Mach number. From the moment the aircraft crosses the boundary, the crew is bound to hold that number until control gives them a new one. Not approximately, precisely. And out of that discipline, controllers build separation out of time rather than distance. The standard gap between two aircraft on the same track at the same assigned speed is 10 minutes. That's it. 10 minutes of arithmetic holding apart two jets full of people over an ocean where nothing can be verified visually. Now you can see why the speed matters so much. If an aircraft drifts even 2/100ths of a Mach above its clearance, it starts closing on the aircraft in front. Drift the same amount below, and it risks being overtaken from behind or squeezing the buffer that somebody else needs to change altitude. The tolerance is that tight. Change by 2/100ths or more, and you are required to tell somebody. Controllers even have a rule of thumb for it. For every 600 nautical miles between the ocean entry and exit points, you add 1 minute of spacing for each 1/100th of a Mach difference between two aircraft. 1/100th. That's the resolution this whole system runs at. So the aircraft isn't holding a fixed speed because a fixed speed is efficient. It's holding it because the arithmetic that keeps it away from other aircraft has that number written into it, which means the moment of crossing that boundary is not a routine one. And this is the part passengers never notice. 20 to 30 minutes before the entry fix, the workload on the flight deck goes up sharply. The crew requests and receives the oceanic clearance. They load it. They cross-check the waypoint coordinates against the paperwork independently because a single mistyped digit of latitude puts the aircraft somewhere nobody expects it. They set the assigned Mach and prime the autothrottle to hold it. And the timing is its own constraint. Being 3 or 4 minutes off at the boundary isn't a small error. It ripples into conflicts with aircraft hundreds of miles ahead and behind hours later. There's the first reversal, the quietest, emptiest looking stretch of the entire flight. The part where the cabin lights go down and there's nothing outside the window is the most calculation-intensive phase of a long-haul crossing. Everything that keeps that aircraft safe for the next 5 hours is decided in the 20 minutes before it goes dark. But we still haven't got to the expensive part. Because holding a fixed speed is one thing. The cost is in what the aircraft is prevented from doing. Modern airliners run a number called the cost index. It's a setting the airline chooses that expresses how it values time against fuel. A low-cost index says fuel is expensive, fly slower. A high one says time matters more, push on. The flight management system takes that setting and solves for the best speed continuously. It knows the aircraft's weight, and the weight is dropping every minute as fuel burns off. It knows the wind, and the wind changes as the aircraft moves across the ocean. So the ideal speed is never one number. It's a moving target, and the computer tracks it the whole way. Over the ocean, that answer is calculated and then ignored. The crew is flying an assigned Mach number, not an economic one. The FMS can tell them the optimum has moved. It has no authority to act on it. So for hours, the aircraft flies compliance instead of economy. And I want to be careful here, because the popular version of this story overstates it. The assigned Mach isn't automatically slower than the ideal. Sometimes it's close. Sometimes the aircraft is actually being held above what it would otherwise choose. The point isn't that the aircraft is always slowed down. It's that the aircraft has stopped choosing at all, and anything you don't get to choose will be wrong some of the time. Now, watch what happens when it goes wrong. Halfway across, the wind shifts. The forecast the flight plan was built on turns out to be a little off, which is normal, because forecasting winds 5 hours ahead over open ocean is hard. The FMS recalculates and shows the crew that the best speed has moved by 0.03 of a Mach. They can ask for that. There's a procedure. They can send a request over the data link and, if traffic allows, receive a reclearance. Usually they don't bother, because ask what it involves. A message goes to the oceanic controller. The controller has to check that new speed against every aircraft ahead and behind on that track and on crossing tracks, recompute the estimates, and decide whether the change breaks anybody else's 10 minutes. If it does, the answer is no. Meanwhile, the crew has a clearance that's working, an aircraft that's safe, and a request that might be refused anyway. So the crew makes a small, rational decision, not worth it. Hold the assigned Mach, and the extra fuel gets burned. That decision is taken quietly, hundreds of times a day, across the entire North Atlantic, and it never appears on anybody's incident report because nothing went wrong. Which raises the question, everything so far has been circling. If everyone knows about it, why not fix it? And the answer is the thing that makes this story worth telling, because it isn't incompetence and it isn't bureaucracy. The system works only because every aircraft is predictable. That's the entire foundation. The instant one aircraft starts optimizing for itself, adjusting its speed whenever its own numbers say it should, it stops being a known quantity in everyone else's calculation. The aircraft behind it, which was told 10 minutes was a safe gap, is now trailing something that might be slowing down. And the controller can't check because there's nothing to look at. So the inefficiency isn't a flaw in the rule, it is the rule. The fuel that gets burned is what the system charges for keeping aircraft apart when they cannot be observed. It's a safety cost, paid in kerosene, and it's cheaper than the alternative. And there's a second rule out there that proves the same logic from the opposite direction, which almost no passenger has heard of. It's called strategic lateral offset. Modern navigation is so accurate that if two aircraft are cleared along the same track, they'll fly it almost perfectly. Which means that in the rare event something goes wrong vertically, they're in precisely the same piece of sky. So crews are permitted and encouraged to fly deliberately offset to the right of the center line by up to 2 nautical miles. Read that again. The system is so dependent on precision that it has to manufacture a little imprecision on purpose. And it specifies the direction so that even the offset stays predictable, which becomes obvious the moment you look at the same aircraft in different airspace. Take that identical jet with that identical crew flying across a continent with radar coverage. Controllers hand out speed changes constantly. Crews request them and get them. Aircraft descend, deviate, speed up, slow down, all with a controller watching a live picture and adjusting in seconds. Nothing about the airplane is different. The physics haven't changed. What's changed is that somebody can see it. That's the trade at the heart of all of this. Surveillance buys you the right to behave selfishly. Where you can be watched, you can optimize for yourself, because somebody has the information to catch it if you create a problem. Where you can't be watched, you have to become predictable for everybody else's benefit, and predictability costs money. And here's what makes the timing of all this interesting. The blind spot is closing. Since March of 2019, the North Atlantic has been covered by space-based ADS-B, a network of receivers carried on satellites that picks up the same broadcasts aircraft already transmit. The difference in what controllers see is enormous. Position updates went from roughly every 14 minutes to every 7 or 8 seconds. The consequences followed quickly. Minimum separation between aircraft on the same track came down from around 40 nautical miles to about 14. In 2011, the longitudinal minimum had already been reduced to 5 minutes for suitably equipped aircraft, and satellite surveillance made that far more usable. Then the structure itself started loosening. Those fixed transatlantic tracks, the ones drawn fresh twice a day to chase the jet stream, had barely changed in concept since the 1960s. Two flows, a westbound stream leaving Europe in the morning and an eastbound stream leaving North America in the evening, riding the jet stream that runs from west to east. From March of 2022, flight level 330 and below came out of the track system entirely, so operators can file their own routes down there. In March of 2025, the old Blue Spruce contingency routes, a leftover from the Second World War, were finally retired. There have even been trial days where no tracks were published at all in either direction, and airlines were asked to plan their own optimum route and speed. One study estimated route optimization of that kind could cut about 200 kilometers from an average crossing. So the constraint is being dismantled slowly as the surveillance improves. Which tells you it was never really about the ocean. It was about the gap in what we could see. And that's the honest answer to the question in the title. Your aircraft isn't slowing down because water is underneath it, or because the engines behave differently, or because of some rule written by people who don't understand aviation. It holds one number because for a few hours it becomes a line in a calculation instead of a dot on a screen. And calculations only stay accurate if nothing surprises them. Every aircraft out there is trusting the others to be exactly as boring as they promise to be. You're not paying for the distance. You're paying for the fact that nobody can see you. Which raises one last question. If satellites can now watch every aircraft over every ocean on Earth, second by second, why do those fixed tracks still exist at all? That's the next one.